They always smiled at me like I was someone's aunt who'd wandered into the wrong meeting. Too soft, too gentle, too motherly. I heard those words whispered in halls, passed like jokes in the break room. I was never meant to hear them, but people get careless when they don't think of you as a threat. And me? I was Elaine Porter, the sweet assistant director of human resources at Medcore Instruments. 49 years old, 2 grown daughters, a husband who taught chemistry at the local high school, and a cardigan for every day of the week. I had been with Medcore for 15 years. I was the one who remembered birthdays, organized baby showers, and mediated tense conversations between employees and managers. They said I was the heart of the company. But apparently I wasn't its spine, or brain, or whatever body part they thought real power belonged to. Because when it came time to restructure or promote or decide who'd get a seat at the strategy table, it was never me. Not once. I stayed in my lane and everyone liked me there. Because I kept things moving smoothly, because I listened without interrupting, because I didn't make waves. But here's the thing they never understood about me. Kindness isn't passivity. It's choice. And I made that choice every day, even as I watched people half my age, with half my experience, leapfrog ahead of me in title and salary. Then came the new wave of managers. People like Travis Hale, flashy, aggressive, and deeply insecure. Travis had just turned 35 and strutted around like he'd invented employee onboarding. He treated our department like a stepping stone to his eventual throne. I watched as he started drawing lines in the sand, people who were players and people who were safe. I was filed neatly under safe. That was his first mistake. The second was thinking I was too soft to notice. But I did notice. I saw how he manipulated newer employees, how he twisted procedures just enough to blur accountability. I saw him steal credit for initiatives I'd built from scratch. And I swallowed it day after day because I believed that doing good work would eventually speak for itself. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Not in places like Medcore. What finally broke me wasn't betrayal. It wasn't even injustice. It was the paper, a simple piece of paper, slid across my desk one Thursday afternoon. "Can you sign off on this real quick?" Travis asked, flashing that rehearsed grin. "It's just a standard update to the wellness stipend. You know the drill." I had a meeting in 5 minutes. My phone was ringing. My inbox had 37 unread emails. I glanced at the paper, saw the familiar formatting, and signed it, and that signature would become the knife they stuck in my back. A week later, the CFO called me into her office. "I'm afraid this is serious, Elaine." There was no smile, no gentle lead-in, just an accusation that I had knowingly approved a reallocation of funds from employee wellness to executive bonuses. The document had my signature. The numbers were clear. And the investigation had already been conducted, quietly, without me ever knowing. They called it misconduct. I called it a setup. I tried to explain. I begged for time to review the document. But it was done. HR protocol required a formal resignation in exchange for a sealed record. They framed it as a graceful exit, a way to preserve my reputation. I sat in silence as they handed me my own coffin, tied neatly with a thank you ribbon. I walked out of Medcore that day with a single box of belongings and 15 years of service reduced to a cautionary tale. The hardest part wasn't losing the job. It was realizing how disposable I'd always been to them. The same people who came to me crying after layoffs. The same managers who called me to handle things they didn't want to face themselves. The same employees who hugged me at Christmas parties and told me I was the glue holding it all together. None of them called. Not one. For 2 weeks, I didn't leave the house. I sat on the back porch, sipping tea until it went cold, watching. The wind moved through the trees like it was whispering things I couldn't quite hear. My husband, Daniel, tried to reach me, gently, patiently, but I was lost in humiliation, not just from the company, but from myself. How could I have been so blind, so trusting, so soft? Then one morning, I opened my laptop. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was habit, or maybe it was instinct. I typed in the login to my personal email, The one I'd use to back up certain files, just in case, as I always told myself. And there it was, a folder labeled Policy Revisions, Travis Drafts. Inside were dozens of documents, early versions of the very paper I had signed, each with tracked changes, metadata, and, most damning of all, notes forwarded from his personal email account, accidentally copied to mine on one late night months ago. I clicked. I read. I reread. And I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Heat. Rising from my chest, spreading through my arms, sharpening every part of me that had dulled from grief. Because now, I had proof. Not just of my innocence, but of their guilt. The question wasn't whether I could clear my name. It was whether I'd be nice about it, because I had been kind for a long, long time. But they forgot that kindness, when betrayed, becomes something else entirely. It becomes precise. It becomes patient. And if you've underestimated it long enough, it becomes power. You never think your downfall will begin with a favor. Not when it's just a quick signature. Not when it's for someone you've worked beside for years. Not when you've built your whole professional identity around being the one who always helps. But that's exactly how they got me. It was a Thursday afternoon. Too late in the week for surprises and too early for wine. I was buried in emails, onboarding forms, exit interviews, all the invisible labor that keeps a company running while others take the credit. That's when Travis walked in. He had that signature grin, the one that always hovered between charming and condescending. Elaine, I hate to bother you, but legal's been on my back about this budget update. Just a formality. Can you give it a quick signature? I'll take care of the rest. I didn't even glance at the whole thing. I trusted Travis. Or rather, I trusted the version of him I'd known when he first started. Ambitious, yes, but respectful, eager to learn. Back then, he'd sit in my office for hours asking about old HR cases, curious about how we handled crises before things became so sanitized. That version was long gone, of course. But I didn't see it clearly then. I signed the document. With that one kind act, I handed them the blade they would use to gut me. The fallout came fast. The following Tuesday, I was summoned, not invited, to a meeting with our CFO, Darlene. Reed. She was a statuesque woman with a voice like a paper cut, thin, sharp, and guaranteed to sting. I'd worked with her for over a decade, but that day there was no small talk. Her office was cold. On purpose, I think. She slid a folder across the table. Your signature, your department's oversight, the reallocation of $92,000 in wellness, funds to executive discretionary bonuses. I blinked. That can't be right. She didn't blink. It was submitted through your login, signed with your approval. There's a timestamp, a trail, and now there's a board of directors. Demanding accountability. I flipped through the folder, my hands shaking. The numbers were there, highlighted, brutal, and worst of all, familiar, because they looked exactly like the paper I'd signed. The same layout, the same line items, the same, trust me, it's routine, formatting. I didn't know, I whispered. Darlene leaned back. Then you should have. That was it. No chance to explain, no investigation, just an HR report citing negligence and a voluntary resignation form waiting for my pen, the same pen I had used to sign that cursed document. They didn't fire me. They erased me. There was no team-wide announcement. No farewell email drafted on my behalf. No sheet cake in the break room. I packed my things in silence while others stared at their screens a little too hard, pretending not to notice. Only Marcy, my assistant, dared to meet my eyes. I'm sorry, she said, tears forming. I know this isn't right. I smiled at her, the same way I smiled at every wedding, funeral, and layoff I'd ever managed. With practiced calm, with grace. Then I walked out. At home, I crumbled. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My husband tried everything, home-cooked meals, walks in the park, reruns of my favorite sitcoms, but nothing broke through the fog. I kept replaying it. Travis's face, the signature, the folder, the way my years of loyalty had been boiled, down to a liability. For days, I stared at that word in the HR report. Negligence. It echoed through me like a curse. It wasn't just a job title I'd lost. It was my integrity, my identity. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I needed to move on, that there was no point fighting a system rigged to protect people like Travis and punish people like me, people who were easy to blame. But something wouldn't let me go. Late one night, unable to sleep, I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. As I sipped, my gaze fell on the drawer beside the fridge, the one where we kept old receipts, tax documents, and random flash drives. And there it was, a black USB drive, unmarked, barely the size of a paperclip. I'd forgotten I even had. I plugged it into my laptop. The folders loaded slowly, a habit I had developed over the years, backing up important files at home, just in case. It wasn't paranoia, it was professionalism. That's what I'd always told myself. I clicked into the policy revisions folder. Dozens of drafts, meeting notes, email chains, budget versions with timestamps. But one file stood out, a version of the wellness fund allocation sheet dated weeks before I signed the final copy. The metadata showed it had been edited multiple times by Travis Hale, and then I saw it, a forwarded email from Travis's personal Gmail account to his work. Mail. The subject line read, "Final draft. Use Elaine's signature." My stomach dropped. I clicked it open. The body was short. "Use this version. She won't question it. Get her to sign before legal sees it." It had been sent at 11:14 p.m., 2 days before he handed me the document, and I had it. The smoking gun. Stared at the screen, my pulse pounding. Part of me wanted to scream, to call Darlene and demand they retract the resignation. Another part, the softer part, the sweet part, just wanted to cry. But I did neither. Instead, I saved everything. Backed up the USB to a secure cloud. I printed hard copies. I encrypted the files. And then I made a list. Names, titles, dates, connections. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew I wasn't going to stay silent. They thought that signature ruined me, but it would become the very thing that proved their guilt. I wasn't out for revenge, not yet. I just wanted the truth, and I wanted it to hurt. The house was too quiet. After 15 years of endless emails, constant conversations, and being everyone's emotional sponge at MedCorp, the silence of unemployment hit me like a brick wall. My days, once filled with meetings and mediation, had been replaced by the dull hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of leaves outside the window. I didn't know how to be still. Not after years of putting out everyone else's fires. At first, I tried to pretend it was a vacation. I made breakfast for Daniel, folded laundry, organized the spice rack alphabetically. But by the third day, I was pacing the living room like a caged animal. The shame hadn't faded. If anything, it was growing heavier. People talked, even if I couldn't hear them. And the worst part? No one reached out. Not a single call from anyone at MedCorp, not even a half-hearted, "How are you holding up?" email. I had vanished, and no one noticed, or cared. It stung. But pain has a funny way of clarifying things. I started combing through the files I had saved, piece by piece. Every document, every forwarded email, every timestamp. I opened old backups, compared draft versions, and created a timeline of events. I didn't know what I was building, only that I had to build something. There's a numbness that sets in when you're betrayed. It dulls your senses, makes everything feel like you're underwater. But once that fog lifted, what I felt wasn't sadness anymore. It was fury, controlled, calculating fury. The kind of rage that doesn't lash out, but instead sits quietly, taking notes. And I had taken a lot of notes. There was something deeply ironic about being pushed out for negligence, when in reality, I had been the only one paying attention for years. I had seen how Travis rose through the ranks, not by merit, but by manipulation. I remembered how he conveniently forgot to CC people on important emails. How he rewrote minutes from meetings to position himself as the brains behind initiatives. How he always had someone else to blame when things went wrong. I just hadn't realized I was going to be his final scapegoat. I started charting everything. A literal timeline pinned to my dining room wall. Sticky notes, string, folders. It looked like something from a crime drama, and in a way, it was. Only this time, the victim wasn't dead, just professionally ambushed. Daniel watched it all quietly. He never pressured me to move on, never suggested that I let it go. Instead, he bought me a corkboard and helped me organize files. Then, one evening, as we sat drinking tea in silence, he said, "What are you going to do with all of this?" I didn't answer right away. Because honestly, I didn't know. I wasn't a fighter. I wasn't a lawyer or a whistleblower or some high-powered executive with connections. I was Elaine Porter, a 49-year-old woman who wore sensible shoes and brought banana bread to office meetings. I didn't launch wars. I smoothed things over. At least, I used to. That night, I called an old college friend, Meredith Shaw. She had studied labor law while I majored in psychology. We'd lost touch over the years, but I remembered her fiery personality and fierce sense of justice. I wasn't sure what I expected, maybe just advice. But when I told her what had happened, there was silence on the line. Then she said 5 words that would change everything. "Elaine, you have a case." I blinked. A case? A real one. If you have those emails and metadata, if they framed you and forced a resignation under false pretenses, that's more than unethical. That's grounds for litigation. My heart pounded. But they're a corporation. They have money, lawyers, power. "So do I," she said, her voice steel. "And you have the truth." We agreed to meet the following week. That gave me time to dig deeper. I wanted more than enough. I wanted everything. The next few days were a blur of discovery. With each file I opened, the full picture came into focus. Travis had been building his ascent on the backs of people like me. And I wasn't the first. I found correspondence suggesting he'd buried complaints from junior employees. I found redacted memos, misfiled HR violations, and at least 2 emails where he joked about dodging bullets thanks to Elaine the Human Shield. They had laughed at me behind closed doors. That was their final mistake. When Meredith arrived, at my house, she brought 2 legal pads and a laptop. She listened as I laid out everything: the betrayal, the silence, the proof. By the time I finished, her jaw was tight and her eyes were blazing. "We're not just going after your job." "Back," she said. "We're going after them." It still didn't feel real. Me? Suing a corporation? But as she explained the process, I realized something powerful. I wasn't alone anymore. I had been exiled, humiliated, discarded. But I wasn't broken. They had taken my reputation, but they had left me my mind. And my memory. And my receipts. I didn't want revenge for its own sake. I wanted justice, not just for me, but for every Elaine they'd trampled on the way up, for every kind employee who got written off as weak, for every quiet professional who was never given a voice. This wasn't going to be loud. It wasn't going to be messy. It was going to be precise, strategic, and unstoppable. Because the woman they underestimated, she's not gone. She's just getting started. It began with folders, plain, color-coded folders, red for internal emails, blue for policy documents, yellow for meeting notes, green for copies of my performance reviews, all glowing, all recent. I laid them across the dining room table like a general mapping out a campaign. This wasn't just catharsis. It was preparation. Meredith, my lawyer and former college roommate, watched with a calm intensity as I explained each piece. Her pen scratched across legal pads in neat, ruthless shorthand. "Elaine," she said after the 3rd pot of tea, "you weren't just wronged. You were professionally assassinated." I blinked. Assassinated. The word was harsh, theatrical even. But as I looked around at the evidence I'd gathered, my name in official HR reports, the forged document, Travis's late-night email telling someone to use Elaine's signature, I realized she was right. They didn't just let me go. They engineered my fall, and I had the receipts. Meredith began assembling the case with surgical precision. We started with a wrongful termination claim, even though I had technically resigned. Forced resignation under duress is still termination under the law. Add to that the misrepresentation of documents, the breach of internal ethics policy, and the emotional and reputational damage. It was a stronger case than I'd ever imagined. But this wasn't just about the courts. It was about the company. Medcore wasn't some nameless conglomerate. It prided itself on being people first. It boasted an annual charity gala, a glossy diversity report, and a smiling CEO who made TikToks about workplace wellness. The media loved Medcore, but no one had ever told them what Medcore looked like behind closed doors, behind staged diversity panels and mental health webinars, behind HR that covered up more than it protected. I knew. I had lived it. I had bled for it. So while Meredith drafted the formal complaint and lined up a press strategy, I worked in the shadows. I created an anonymous email account and reached out to a few former employees, people who'd been quietly pushed out over the years. One had left after filing a sexual harassment report that was handled internally, meaning buried. Another was a brilliant data analyst who was let go after uncovering major discrepancies in product testing. Both of them replied, both of them had stories, and both of them still had documentation. We met at a quiet cafe in the suburbs, the kind of place where no one asks questions and the coffee is strong enough to keep secrets. I always thought I was alone, one of them said. You weren't, I replied. They just made you feel that way. What started as a lawsuit was slowly becoming something bigger, a coalition, a network of the discarded. I wasn't organizing a rebellion, not exactly, but I was building something harder to ignore. Truth, layered with credibility, wrapped in documentation, sharpened by betrayal. Every evening, I'd sit with Daniel at the kitchen table. He'd read the updates from Meredith while I scrolled through my compiled notes. He never once told me to stop. He never asked me why I wasn't moving on. Instead, one night, he simply said, "They thought they buried you, but you were planting roots." God, I loved that man. The press strategy came next. Meredith contacted a journalist from Workplace Watchdog, an investigative outlet known for exposing corporate misconduct. We didn't go public yet, but we fed them a thread, just enough to spark curiosity. A high-level whistleblower, internal corruption, a company known for virtue signaling and backroom deals. The reporter responded within hours. "I want the story," he wrote. "Soon," Meredith replied. "We're almost ready." But the final step, the sharpest claw in my kindness, came when we requested discovery. Legally, once we filed the lawsuit, Medcore would be obligated to provide internal documents related to my case, emails, messages, audit trails. And Meredith was strategic in how she worded it. We weren't just asking for paperwork, we were asking for their intentions. Travis had no idea what was coming. Neither did Darlene, the CFO who had shoved the folder across her desk, like she was handing me a resignation letter instead of a death sentence. I used to think she was untouchable, cold and calculating and terrifying in her indifference. But now she was just another executive who had backed the wrong man, because while they thought I was crumbling, I was constructing. They thought I was silent, but I was documenting, and while they imagined me sipping tea in my slippers, I was preparing to dismantle them. Piece by piece. Kindness, I've always believed, is underestimated. But kindness backed by strategy? That's lethal, and when you've been pushed to the edge by the very people you once protected, the claws come out. I wasn't going to raise my voice. I wasn't going to scream. I was going to use their own words, their own documents, their own mistakes, and when I was done, they wouldn't just regret what they'd done to me. They'd regret underestimating every soft woman who ever kept their secrets. The envelope was delivered on a Tuesday, not via email, not some sterile notification in an inbox. No. Meredith had it hand-delivered by a court officer, right to the front desk of Medcore Instruments. There was no ceremony, no announcement, just a silent drop, a signature, and a sealed packet with my name on it, and theirs. Within the hour, the silence shattered. I wasn't in the building to witness it, of course, but whispers move faster than light in corporate corridors. I had allies, still hidden, still employed, who had once come to me when they were too scared to speak. Now they spoke on my behalf. First, it was the receptionist who called her sister, a friend of mine from the community center. Then it was an anonymous LinkedIn message. Elaine, did you really sue them? I hope to God you win. And finally, Marcy, my former assistant, sent me a text. They're panicking. That was all. And that was enough, because the lawsuit wasn't just a legal move. It was a mirror, held up to all their carefully curated lies. It named names: Travis Hale, Darlene Reed, and 2 other executives who had co-signed the cover-up. It outlined the manipulation, the fraudulent document, the coercion of my resignation, and most importantly, the pattern. We didn't just accuse them of targeting me. We showed how they'd done it before, and we proved they'd do it again. Meredith had attached sworn affidavits from 2 former employees, both of whom had faced eerily similar fates. One was offered a promotion, only to be shoved out after raising questions about budget misreporting. The other had signed a routine compliance update that conveniently tied her to a failed supplier contract. She, too, had resigned under pressure. 3 stories, different faces, same blueprint. The board of directors at MedCorp had no choice but to respond. Their lawyers contacted Meredith within 48 hours. They offered a quiet settlement, generous even. Full NDA. Confidential payout. No admission of wrongdoing, of course. Just a polite, let's put this behind us. But I wasn't done. I didn't want silence. I wanted clarity. I wanted consequences. And for the first time, I wanted the truth to stop hiding behind kindness. So we rejected the first offer. Politely, of course. Meredith was surgical in her response. My client is not interested in settlement unless the following conditions are met. And then came the list. A public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a revision to my personnel file, and full cooperation with an internal ethics investigation led by an independent third party. That's when the real unraveling began. Travis was placed on administrative leave within a week, not fired. Not yet, but sidelined. Out of the spotlight he loved so much, out of the meetings where he usually dominated the airspace with buzzwords and self-congratulations. I heard through the grapevine that he hadn't taken it well, that he smashed a mug against his office wall, that he threatened to take everyone down with him, that he cried in the parking garage. I didn't rejoice in his breakdown. I wasn't vindictive for its own sake. But I did find peace in the fact that for once, he had to sit in silence and stew in the mess he created, alone. Then came the media. Workplace Watchdog published the article a few days later. The headline was, Everything I'd Hoped. The kindness. Clause, how MedCorp's HR darling was betrayed and fought back. It went viral, not because of me. I wasn't famous. I didn't have a platform, but because the story resonated. With every woman who'd been told she was too emotional for leadership. With every employee who'd taken the fall for someone else's ambition. With every quiet, capable person who had ever been chewed up by a toxic workplace and spit out in silence. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. Former employees began sharing their stories on Reddit, on Glassdoor, even in the comment section of the article. One anonymous user wrote, Elaine trained me when I joined MedCorp. She made me feel safe. She's the reason I stayed as long as I did. What they did to her was criminal. Another, I still have the birthday card she gave me, handwritten. She deserved better. My name became more than a footnote. It became a symbol, and that terrified them. MedCorp released a statement, sterile, legal, tone-deaf. We take these allegations seriously and are committed to investigating them thoroughly. We thank Ms. Porter for her years of service. Years of service. That's what they called it. Not leadership, not integrity, just service. But at that point, I didn't care, because they were losing control of the narrative, and I was taking it back, one paragraph at a time. The ethics firm began their interviews. Meredith made sure the process was recorded, monitored, and transparent. Meanwhile, I sat at home, no longer pacing, no longer stewing, but calm. Steady, sharp. Daniel and I went on long walks again. I smiled more. I laughed. I started volunteering at a local workforce empowerment nonprofit, helping women re-enter the job market after layoffs. I taught resume writing and mock interviews. And when one woman, barely 30, looked at me and said, I just feel so small, I told her. So did I. But small doesn't mean weak. It means underestimated. And underestimated people, we're the ones who change everything when we stand up. By month's end, Travis Hale resigned for personal reasons. Darlene Reed transitioned to an advisory role. And Medcore, the company that once claimed to be powered by people, was now under review by both the EEOC and a state labor board. I never raised my voice. Never made threats. Never played dirty. I fought with facts, with truth, with the very empathy they once mocked, and I had one more move left. But that was for the final chapter. They wanted me gone quietly, and in a way, I gave them what they wanted. I never raised my voice. I didn't show up with cameras. I didn't throw coffee or slam doors. I simply gathered what they gave me. The lies, the manipulation, the carelessness, and handed it back, wrapped in proof. By the time it was over, the version of me they had mocked no longer existed. I didn't win with force. I won with patience and precision. After Travis resigned, the company scrambled to plug the hole. He left. Darlene disappeared behind corporate jargon, transitioned into a vague role no one could quite define. The media didn't stop calling, and every time Medcore tried to put out the fire, a new spark lit elsewhere. Another former employee. Speaking up, another policy uncovered. Meredith called me 2 weeks later with the final offer. They've agreed to all the terms, she said. Public acknowledgement, personnel file cleared, formal apology letter, full payout. I was quiet for a long time, she added. It's more than most people ever get. I smiled. Not because of the money, though I'll admit it was substantial. It was justice wrapped in a wire transfer. But that wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that they had written me off, and I rewrote the ending. The press eventually moved on, as it always does. New scandals, new names. But my story left a mark. In HR circles, people whispered about the Elaine case. Companies quietly updated policies. Trainings changed. I even heard that one mid-sized firm in New Jersey started calling their ethics, course the kindness clause. I didn't ask for fame, but I had become a lesson, and I could live with that. With the settlement finalized, I finally allowed myself to stop, not collapse. Not disappear. Just breathe. For the first time in years, I wasn't waking up to dread. No last-minute meetings, no fake smiles, no forced loyalty. I had my mornings back, my coffee, my peace. And with that peace came purpose. It started with one woman, the young one I'd met at the job center. She didn't know how to explain her worth in interviews. She kept calling herself lucky whenever something went well. I recognized that look in her eyes, the same one I saw in the mirror for years. So I stayed late after a class and helped her rewrite her resume. We talked through mock interviews, confidence drills, boundaries, and slowly she changed. She got a job offer at a nonprofit 6 weeks later. When she told me, she cried. "You saw me when no one else did," she whispered. I hugged her, holding back my own tears. Because I had once needed someone to see me too, and maybe that's what I'd become now. Not just a survivor, but a mirror for others. That's how the Quiet Power Project was born. A simple name, a simple mission, to empower women in the workplace, especially those who had been dismissed, manipulated, or silenced. I offered workshops on workplace rights, negotiation strategies, and leadership without aggression. I didn't tell them to roar. I taught them to speak in ways that made the room stop and listen. Within months, it grew. A blog, then a podcast. People sent in letters, stories, questions. I wasn't a celebrity. But I was trusted. And in a world that throws women away the moment they're no longer useful, trust is power. Daniel set up a spare room as my home office. He printed a small plaque for the door. Elaine Porter, soft, sharp, unstoppable. He never once doubted me. And when I asked him why, he said, "Because I've seen what kindness can do when it's fed up." Every once in a while, I'd get an email from someone at Medcore. Most were anonymous. Former interns, assistants, even a junior manager. All variations of the same message. You made it okay to speak up. They said you were weak, but You were the strongest one there. You made them finally afraid of doing it again. I kept every single one. Not out of pride, but out of reminder. That silence isn't always surrender. And soft doesn't mean submissive. It means knowing exactly who you are and refusing to let the world decide otherwise. Now, when I stand in front of a room full of women, I start with a story. Not about lawsuits or scandals or headlines, but about a signature, one small, kind act, and how it nearly ruined me. Then I tell them how I came back, not with fury, but with facts, not with vengeance, but with resolve, and not by becoming someone harder or colder, but by staying exactly who I was, only stronger. So no, I didn't win by shouting. I won by remembering what they tried to take and choosing every single day to never let them take it again.